in that root is ibogaine. And so that has been used to treat opiate disorders and other substance abuse disorders. And it's really interesting. I think, again, they're still doing a lot of research on it, but it does something physiologically to the brain where it like resets receptors, and sometimes people don't go through intense withdrawals. I mean, it's a very intense psychedelic experience. Some people say it could last up to like 12 to 14 hours, and then it also has a little bit higher risk with like cardiac issues. So if anybody has like any cardiovascular disease or anything like that, you have to be really careful with administrating that. But that one's tied mostly to opiate disorders. And, from some of the research that I've seen and just hearing about stories of people struggling with this and receiving an ibogaine treatment, people say it's just completely saved their life and turned their life around. I think there's huge potential there. I know NYU is doing a study right now on MDMA and alcoholism. Obviously a little bit different, but I think they're in the early stages and haven't really released too much data on that study yet. But and I think there's another study with psilocybin and cocaine use. And Johns Hopkins did one for psilocybin and smoking cessation, and found that people that went through a psilocybin-assisted therapy model had definitely a decrease in smoking. And so it almost kind of like reframes like what addiction is in a sense. And I don't know if you follow any of the addiction stuff, but there's a lot of different theories out there, and Gabor Mate has some really interesting theories, and there's another guy, I always forget his name, but he has this really popular quote. I think his last name's Hari, but he says, the opposite of addiction is connection. And so it's like this lack of connection. And then on Gabor Mate's side, he talks a lot about trauma and like adverse childhood events, really kind of, playing a huge role into substance abuse and other addictive disorders. So it's almost like these substances can help us dig into maybe at the root cause of what's going on there. So if trauma is at the root cause of some addictions, what would it be like to actually have an intervention that allows the person to dig into the trauma or the part of the psyche and to examine it in a different way, and maybe let it go, maybe come to acceptance of it, or maybe get really shooken up by it and be like, whoa, what have I been doing this whole time? I think there could be some huge potential there for psychedelics and different addictions.
Turns out daddy issues isn't exclusive to strippers and porn stars.
Is that true?
No, I mean, I think... everyone, always when they see something like one of those types of individuals, they always talk about daddy issues or mommy issues. I have a friend who is very well read, and he told me, I don't think anyone really escapes childhood without some sort of trauma.
Yeah, I mean, we're all kind of traumatized in a sense, right? And it's like I guess the big thing is like, how have we developed resilience? Some people develop resilience from trauma and they grow from it, and other times, depending on how severe it was or what was going on, maybe that resilience wasn't developed, and then that manifests into much larger issues.
Right.
Yeah, I've done 2 ceremonies with Iboga, 2 flood doses, and Iboga definitely showed me all those walls that I built up and all those protectors I've put up, due to trauma or stuff like that. So I can definitely relate. And I definitely think, I haven't done Ibogaine, I've done an Iboga, but just based on what I got from Iboga, I think with people with addiction issues, it could definitely break through the barrier and kind of turn on the light.
Yeah, and the people that I've talked to that struggled with addiction and like opiate use, that have been through that treatment, I mean, completely just said it's changed their life. I mean, they would have been dead if they didn't seek that out. So Yeah, was your experience pretty intense?
It was super intense. Like,
wait a second. This kid had never done any psychedelics whatsoever and went right to Iboga. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I've heard a few people with that. That's a pretty intense jump.
Well, so just to give you a little background, I'm a wrestler and full ego, and if Aubrey Marcus says this is the most intense psychedelic you could do, that's the one I wanted to do. Definitely not ready. I think a little, microdose of LSD would have been better to start off with. But it was 2 pretty much 48-hour trips. You don't sleep, you don't eat, and on the back end of that, I would say it was like 2.5 to 3 years. Even now, still processing the stuff I got. And what I would say,
I can imagine.
Yeah, and what I would say to anyone, if you've got some shit that you're not dealing with, Iboga is just going to put it into the front of your mind till you deal with it, and not going to let you ignore anything you might ignore on a regular basis. So if there's some stuff that you might think you're suppressing, Iboga will definitely let you know, and it won't go away till you deal with it. That's kind of my experience with Iboga. I'd recommend it for someone who's just suffering and kind of wants to change, and get that little bit of a push. But that said, I would say do your research and know what you're getting yourself into, because you're about to go on a trip for sure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and if it's like last resort stuff, if somebody's really struggling, it's like, this kind of comes back to this whole idea of like cognitive liberty and just treatment. It's like, sometimes people, like, we should have access to these options, right? Because it's like thinking about, I was just talking to somebody that is doing work with vets, and it's like, what's the option here? How many vets are committing suicide, and we have potential medicine that could be really useful, and it's like, what's the option? The research isn't saying that it's useful yet. I mean, it is useful, but we don't have enough data. And then the other option for most of these people is like suicide, or if you're thinking about like opiate disorders, like overdosing and dying. And it's just like, it's the accessibility and the option thing, I think, is just so huge. And the science is needed, and we need that, but I think we also sometimes need to think about the alternatives that people are facing, which is sometimes death, suicide, overdosing, and all that. And, even though these experiences can be really, really challenging or really intense, like, is there a potential for a person to change their life, or is that other alternative is them just like, ending up 6 feet under, and that's where like some of this advocacy and education really comes into. It's like, we need some of these options. People don't have time, which is, it's really disappointing at times when you really think about it.
And it's tough to argue with the relapse or the lack thereof relapses from people that go into Iboga or Ibogaine
yeah,
versus meetings, or what do they give people that are instead of taking methadone?
Oh, methadone, like Suboxone treatment.
Yeah, I mean, it's just you're just trading one thing for the other. Whereas if you go into one of these ceremonies or work with one of these people, the success rate is astronomical in terms of how high the percentages of people not relapsing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, these are things that we have to take into consideration. And then on the flip side too, like, you're talking about relapse and stuff like that. So it made me think about the topic of integration and environment. And that, some people that are struggling, they might find deep healing in this work, and then they go back to an environment that just doesn't foster change. And there is the potential for people to relapse, whether that's like, emotional kind of relapse, like they relapse into their depression or suicide ideation or whatever that is after engaging in some of this work, or relapsing with substances or addictive processes. The integration part for this work is huge. And that's one thing that we focus on at Psychedelics Today, like educating about, there's a huge potential here for mental health treatment, but it also entails a lot of work and post work. And so, I've definitely talked to people that have had really intense ibogaine sessions or iboga sessions, and then went back to like an environment where it just was like really toxic, and they went back to like their old lifestyle, and they just kind of fell right back into it again. And so, the integration phase and working with your environment and trying to make those changes, bring those lessons back and actually move them forward. I think that's a huge part of this work as well.
And I think a lot of people may not think of reintegration that deeply. I think a lot of people only think of it like, a day or two or a week after a couple ceremonies, be it iboga, ibogaine, ayahuasca, even some heavy doses of psilocybin. They think of reintegration as, I need to stay here at the retreat for an extra 2 or 3 days, and then they go right back to normal society, where they're not really thinking of like the people that they're going to and how that's going to affect them, or even if they're not open-minded to it, and how that's going to affect their reintegration. So I think reintegration in itself is something that there needs to be more education on that, or more in-depth discussion on that, and it's just not a couple days after, a week after. It's weeks, months, possibly even years of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think about my near-death experience, and even some of these breathwork or psychedelic experiences I had early on. It's like, man, years later, I'm still trying to make sense of it. I'm like, I got all these like great messages or whatever happened, and I'm like, how am I actually like working with some of this stuff? And I think actually, creating Psychedelics Today with Joe and having these conversations has been a huge part of my integration process. Just to be able to have these conversations, move it forward, and kind of also give back to the community in a sense of like, here are some of my experiences, and here's what other people are saying. And so, how are you bringing your experience and then coming back to your community and maybe being of service somehow?
So talking on integration and how you kind of learn from these experiences, what does that have to do, or how does that entail with the Psychedelics Today 5-week online course?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so this is integration has been, I guess, a huge focus of our work, and I think it really my focus has been on integration, as I mentioned, just from some of my experiences early on, and also this near-death experience of we have these really profound experiences, and so what do we do with it? And I spent a lot of time in my early years, especially when I was doing my transpersonal psychology degree, of like trying to figure out like, what does this all mean, and what's going on here. And then something started shifting where I was like, do I actually care what any of this means? Like, how did it affect my life, and like, what am I doing with it? And so trying to stop figuring out like the mechanisms of action here of like, is this real? Is this all made up? Like, what was going on during my near-death experience? Is that just like physiological brain like reflexes, reflexes of the brain, like. And then I got to this point where I was like, well, like it really impacted my life, and there's something inside of me that wants to move it forward. And like, if I'm just so obsessed trying to figure it out, like, I guess you could move it forward that way by contributing to science and research, but there's just another part of me that just really wanted to do something else with all the energy. And so when you have these really profound experiences, and I think the way people are writing about, like, I had this one session and it completely like healed me and changed my life. That happens sometimes, but I think people aren't always honest about the months and years following those sessions, and a lot of the ups and downs, and actually some of the actual work that they had to put in of making changes. Say like you have this really profound psychedelic experience, and then, as I mentioned, you come back to a toxic environment that's just not supportive of your growth. And so how are you implementing these big visions or these big like downloads that you got of like, I figured out what life is all about and what's important to me, and then you come back to an environment where it's like it's so hard to actually implement those changes. And so, I don't think change really happens unless we start actually working towards that. And so that was like a big focus of mine, and decided to tie it all into a course that we created, I guess, about 2 years ago. And it was called Navigating